I'm having a mild COVID infection at the moment, not too bad. And also, I'm just come off a 2-day webinar on supporting people who've committed, you're not allowed to say committed suicide. I can't get that out of my head. Have died, bereaved from death from suicide. And that's was hard work, as you can imagine. So I'm not actually on top form. I'm also feeling quite nervous, particularly now you've all introduced yourselves and I realise what an illustrious company I'm in. I am not an expert in end of life, I have to say. However, I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about taking personal responsibility for one's own death, and I think that's probably relevant to what you've been talking about and what you're going to talk about in the future. So I'm going to share the screen. I hope this works. Okay, there we go. So the title, Preparing for Death is an Act of Love. I'm going to talk about love, really. In My Own Bed, Please is the organisation that I've been coordinating, and my name is Lyn Jenkins. So just a very brief sketch of my background, a thumbnail sketch. So I was born in Wales, which is why I've got such a funny name, but educated and brought up in Sheffield, so nobody understood why I was not a girl. And I think career probably ought to have a plural on it. And we all have many careers, don't we? There's this sort of the formal career and there's all the other careers that we get involved with. My main career was as a GP. I was educated first at a grammar school in Sheffield, and then I went to Cambridge, to King's College, Cambridge, and did a degree in natural sciences. At the same time, I'd learnt the violin and became very involved with violin playing, and ended up leading the National Youth Orchestra, and very nearly went into a professional career as a violinist. And for a while I couldn't decide what to do, so that was a bit of a distraction, really, from getting a good education. While I was at Cambridge, I spent at least half my time performing, playing quartets and leading orchestras and stuff like that. Then went to Oxford for my clinical studies, having met my wife, who was also a medical student. We went to Oxford together, and then went on to do various jobs, and ended up deciding that we wanted to go into general practice together. I had developed an interest in ophthalmology and did a little bit of training in that and got the diploma, so that my career sort of went along two tracks: general practice for about 2/3 of it, and then throughout the whole career I've also worked as an ophthalmologist, mainly in the field of lasers, particularly retinal lasers, later corneal lasers, and then towards the end involving ophthalmology and primary care together, and developing a primary care ophthalmology service which became countrywide eventually. On retirement, I trained as a luthier, which, as you can see, all these violins here. So I now do a bit of that. I also play a lot. And then I decided I missed medicine after a couple of years. I missed helping people and having direct contact with them. So I trained as a bereavement support volunteer for crews, which is I now do, and I've done for about 5 years. Other activities and influences, well, I've probably covered them actually. I don't want to go into too much detail. So music is my main relaxation and spiritual support, I suppose. In My Own Bed, Please. It began as a result of a conversation I had with my GP right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I went to my GP, he was a friend of mine actually, he'd worked with us for a while as a locum. Incidentally, I didn't say that my wife and I ran a practice together in a small village near here called Great Missenden. So we were the sort of village GPs. So I went to him and I said, look, if I get sick with COVID and the hospitals are overwhelmed, I really don't want to go into hospital and take a bed from somebody, a ventilator from somebody who would benefit more because they're younger and they've got longer to live and so on. So can you help me? You know, if I need your help urgently, what can you do to help me? Can you actually put things in place? Can you get the drugs I need? Can you get me some oxygen? So on. So he said, really, we don't have that capacity anymore to do that. I don't think we can promise to do that in a pandemic situation. So I wrote a letter to The Guardian, which got published, saying that I was concerned that this was the case. And there were probably other people like me who didn't really want to go into hospital for one reason or another. Maybe they were very frail or whatever. And there didn't seem to be any provision for them at the moment. And as a result of that, a group of us, friends and colleagues, got together and wrote an open letter to Boris Johnson, which was published in the Times. There were 19, a mixture of professors of palliative care and GPs and retired president of the College of General Practice, and quite a lot of significant people, a great mixture of people, and it was quite a good letter, I thought, and it got quite a lot of comments and so on, but it didn't actually do any good. And shortly after the letter went in, Boris ended up in hospital anyway, and we wrote another letter to the then Secretary of State for Health, whose name slipped my mind for a moment, and he didn't answer either. Eventually we got a letter back from Helen Waitley about 4 months later. Anyway, we then decide, I'm getting a bit confused, must be the COVID. At the same time, there was an Any Questions with Elora Finlay, who was talking about end-of-life care at home in the pandemic, and I got onto Any Answers the next day and made a response to this. And as a result of that, I then got into Inside Health and had an interview on Inside Health about my views about the situation. So all this led to the formation of In My Own Bed Please. Could we do anything to persuade the government to prioritise the quality of death for people who are almost inevitably going to die, particularly those who wanted to die at home, as well as prioritising survival. So the members of the group consisted of Sir Ian Chalmers, who you may know founded the Cochrane Collaborative and the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford and lives in Oxford, who I hadn't met before, and he got in touch with me because he was meant to be on Inside Health and I bumped him off. and an old friend, Peggy Frith, who's a consultant ophthalmologist in Oxford, now retired. Iona Heath, who actually introduced me to Paul, who's former president of the Royal College of GPs. And a couple of friends, musician friends, brother and sister, a violinist and a cellist, who had a mum who was demented, had dementia and lived in Leeds, and they were very concerned that she shouldn't have to go into hospital if she developed COVID. And between us, we had weekly meetings to decide what we could do to try and influence things. It sounds a really strange thing to do now, looking back on it, but there was this enormous energy that you had to do something, and we were all sort of anxious, and lots of friends and people who didn't want to go into hospital, really frail people, and it seemed desperately important at the time, and it doesn't quite seem so now, but I think that's because everything's changed, hasn't it? It was just a time of high emotion, and we had weekly meetings, and the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine were running a rapid review team of palliative care specialists and the GPs, and they very kindly took me onto the team, and we offered to write blogs in response to their rapid reviews. And that's what we did. During 2020, we wrote 5 blogs in response to their analyses of the research that was being done about palliative care for COVID, particularly palliative care at home. So we wrote a blog about the use of oxygen at home, for example, the risk to carers if somebody stayed at home. We wrote a blog about the guidelines and who'd done the best guidelines, because there were lots of guidelines coming out, and that was a big job to look at all of those and analyse them. It was called Best in Show. And another one about, the final one was about advanced care planning. And at that point, the panel of experts disbanded or decided that they'd done as much as they could. The vaccines were coming online. CBM decided to downgrade the COVID-19 part of their website. And so, and we found we didn't actually have anything else to say in our blogs. And we thought, well, should we stop or should we keep going? And we all felt that we still had some life left in us. So we then developed a website, and we wrote a few more letters, and we got a letter into the Guardian, I think it was January 21, about the worry that primary care was being overwhelmed, and how would people who either wanted to stay at home cope if primary care was overwhelmed, and also how would people who had to stay at home because the hospitals were overwhelmed and therefore they couldn't be admitted, how are they going to cope if primary care was overwhelmed? And that got a lot of interest. And I should say the blogs were extraordinarily well read. I mean, there were 45,000 page reads on the one on oxygen particularly, and between 5 and 10,000 reads on the others. So we seem to be having some sort of impact. Anyway, at that stage, we decided we were going to concentrate on advanced care planning, and we'd come across a lovely nurse called Sophie Thomas, who recently retired from Pembrokeshire, where she had led their advanced care planning team in the Paul Sartori Foundation, which is a hospital at home movement that covers the whole of Pembrokeshire. They don't have any hospices, they just have hospice at home. And it had been a very successful initiative, and we were very interested to know how she'd achieved that. I'd spent a lot of the time contacting all sorts of different places and people and trying to find out who had actually managed care at home in the pandemic well and who hadn't. And we were looking out for people doing reviews later in the following year. And obviously there are now reviews that have come out of how people coped in the community looking after people with COVID at home who then subsequently died. And they have been rather shocking, I have to say. Those are our activities. And then we moved on to, as I say, advanced care planning. And we decided we needed to do our own advanced care plans. I don't know how many of you have done an advanced care plan. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up. But if you have done one, you'll know it's not easy. And if you haven't done one, then it's something that you should do, I think. And we had Sophie's help, and between us, we all managed to achieve plans, and they were surprisingly similar. I mean, they had tweaks which were different, but overall, the plan was very similar, and we got it as simple as we could and as effective as we could. And Sophie had supported people one-to-one in providing over 500 advanced care plans. So she really knew what she was talking about. Plus, she was a hands-on palliative care nurse, and she knew the effect of a good plan compared to either not having one or having one that was ineffective. The future, I would say that In My Own Bed Please is still there. The panel is still there. We don't meet regularly. We meet very occasionally now. And it's rather was like a torrent, or a sort of, like a torrent rushing through a gorge. And now it's sort of settled down into something much calmer. And we have fingers in various pies. We've been helping Talc in Manchester to produce its training for GP trainers. And we've done a session with them on a DNA CPR, and we're going to do another chapter with them on advanced care planning. We've also got a link with a local mortality awareness group called Chiltern Compass in my area, and we're trying to encourage integrated care here. And then the thing I'm going to talk about is our main project. So moving on, you all know, I'm sure, what advanced care planning is, but I thought I would just very, very briefly say what I understand it to be. And that is it has two parts. One is an advanced decision to refuse treatment, and that's a legal document which, if it's properly drawn up, has to be complied with by whoever's looking after you, unless you also have a lasting power of attorney, and that will then override it. And the second part is your wishes and preferences for how you would like your end of life to go. And that isn't a legal document, but it's something that you would hope people would take into consideration if they were looking after you. So when is the best time to make a plan? And I suppose the ideal thing is that once you are of age would be the ideal time. And then as you go through your life, you would revise it. I think in practice, you really start to think about it more when you're over 60, and you can see that you've got less life left than you've lived, sort of thing. But the impression I have from talking to people about advanced care planning is that it's actually a good thing to have a plan before you have a diagnosis of a terminal illness, because then it's much easier to make a plan that fits with the illness that you have, given that that's going to be the most likely cause of your death. The significance in a pandemic or an emergency is that what we found from what the research we did and talking to people was that if you didn't have an advanced care plan in this pandemic, you were almost certainly going to end up in hospital, like it or not. It was very difficult for the paramedics and other people coming to help you in the situation that was existing when the hospitals were almost overwhelmed. Well, I think some of them were overwhelmed actually, to have a conversation that allowed you to stay at home, plus the fact that the infrastructure wasn't there to access emergency end-of-life care. So we realised that this was a key component of achieving a death at home in a pandemic situation, or in a situation where you didn't already have a diagnosis that was going to end your life. And what we also realised, that it was very important that the people who came to your house, or who you talked to on the phone, or whoever it was you sought help from, could access it. And then, of course, that there was access to the services that you hoped you would have.
Lyn, just before you go on, I'm a little bit worried about how we're going to fit the discussion and the feedback thing in. Bear in mind that there's 20 people on the call, I think. How do you want to manage the time now? Because I'm thinking of having something like 20 minutes feedback after 20 minutes discussion. But we can move that around.
Well, I'll take another 10 minutes. Would that be all right?
Okay.
Not more. There are not many more slides.
Okay.
I'll try and speed up. Thank you for warning me. So what effect does having an ACP have on your death? The studies show that if you have an advanced care plan, you are more likely to die in the way that you would prefer to die. And I think that's an important thing to know. It does have an effect. It doesn't always end up that you die in the way that you wanted to die, but you are more likely to. What effect does it have on the carers? Well, if we're talking about unpaid carers, your loved ones, the people you hope are going to look after you, it gives them fair warning that you're expecting them to look after you. And if you've had the necessary discussions and they say, well, actually, I don't think I'm up for that, or whatever, then you're going to have to change your plan. So it means that you're going to have a more realistic response from the carers, and that they are pre-warned. What effect does it have on the healthcare professionals? Well, it makes their job much, much easier, because they're not having to make decisions based on guesswork, or based on a default situation where they feel they've got to act because they don't know what you want, because you don't have the capacity to tell them. What effect does it have on bereavement? And for me, as a bereavement support volunteer, this is probably the most significant thing, that so many people that I support have complicated grief around the quality of death. And it seems to me that having an advanced care plan is a way of reducing that risk of complicated grief. And that's really where it comes to being an act of love. Because if you can reduce the grief that the people you love have when you've gone, then you've given them something very precious. And what I forgot to say, and I don't want to spend too long, was my bereavement experience. I don't know how I missed that out really, because that's quite significant. So just very briefly, and Paul and I have this in common, we both lost our wives, but our experience of their end of life was almost completely different. And for me, it was a life enhancing experience. I looked after my wife for the last month of her life on my own. She just wanted me. And it was a very special time, and she died serenely and comfortably. And it made me recognize how important it was that I knew what she wanted. She hadn't actually written an ACP, but she was able to be quite clear about how she wanted her death to be. She wanted to be at home in her own bed with just me looking after her. And that's what, between us, we managed to achieve. So that was something very special. And I felt for my grief afterwards, that made a big difference. What effect did it have? What does it have on our happiness? My very strong impression, and having done my ACP and talked to other people, is that once you've done an ACP, it lifts a great burden off you. And you can sort of relax. You know you've done the best you can, not only to have a good chance, a better chance, the best possible chance of having a comfortable death, but also that you've reduced the risk of complicated grief for your loved ones. What are the benefits of widespread ACP uptake? I'm going to talk in a minute about how many people have an ACP in this country and in other countries. But I think if there is a big uptake of ACP, then it focuses society in general on end-of-life care. It puts pressure. If people are saying what they want, it puts pressure on the services locally to integrate them properly so that you can get what you're asking for. It also prepares us for the next pandemic so that we don't make the horrendous mistakes we've made in this pandemic, particularly around people dying at home and the quality of their deaths. And interestingly, in places where there is a high ACP uptake, there's an overall reduction in health costs. And it makes people aware of what's possible, likely and deliverable, but individuals as well as the healthcare profession as a whole and the community as a whole. Because when you start to think about it, and I could talk forever about how you support people and what comes up when you start talking about it, people have a very, very vague idea of what it's like to die. They're mostly terrified about the whole idea, but also they don't realise what could happen. And so they haven't thought it through, and so they think they can just stay at home and it'll all be fine and somebody will look after them. And of course we know as GPs that is not the case. And as somebody just said earlier, somebody dying at home well is one of the most difficult things to achieve, and yet it's what most of us would prefer. And then government funding, well, you know, you could talk forever about the fact that the NHS doesn't fund palliative care properly, but anything that improves government support and funding, and I think widespread ACP uptake would possibly do that. So current levels, it's very difficult to get accurate statistics about what the level of ACPs are. You can get figures that are running in this country around 10 to 12% of people with a life-limiting illness who have an ACP. In some areas it's much higher. In Pembrokeshire it's around 40%. Other areas it's much lower. If you look at the adult population as a whole, it's really low in this country. It's probably more like 3%, if that. And you look at doctors and you ask them, you ask GPs, I mean, you'll find it's way under 50% who've actually made an advanced care plan. Some countries, Germany across the board, they say it's 30%. And then there's this extraordinary lacrosse experience, which I'm sure Laura can talk to us about, where Bud Hammond developed an ACP support service, and at death they have 96% of people with an ACP, and it was there that they found a really significant reduction in health costs in the last year of life, something like 40%, I think. The problem is overcoming the barriers just to open the conversation, let alone anything else. Who's going to do that? The GPs have not got the time to do that at the moment. It's like opening a Pandora's box. It involves dealing with people's anticipatory grief about not only their own death, but how their loved ones are going to feel about them dying. And even once you get to talk about it, how do you then get people to do it? Now, there are lots of online tools provided by all sorts of people and written advice, but that doesn't seem to be working. The places where you get higher levels are where there is personal support, one-to-one support or group support to help you to get to the point where you produce an ACP that's worth having. I'll just keep going.
You need to move on quite quickly, Lyn.
Yeah, okay, nearly there. So I'm just wondering, and we're wondering whether there could be a national ACP support service, which would be something like Cruise or something like that, where there is a group of people who are trained to give support, and it can be approached by anybody, either by an individual or by GPs or palliative care consultants if they need it, although they probably don't because they have their own support systems. Who would provide it? Who's going to fund it? What sort of platform should it be on? Who should you train? How do you deliver it? And how do you measure the outcomes? Well, I could talk about all of those for hours, so I'm not going to. And just moving on. So what we're planning to do is to run a pilot. I've been giving talks to children U3A over the pandemic period about end of life issues, about In My Own Bed Please, and about ACP, and they're keen to be part of a pilot which we're going to start at the end of this month with an introductory talk. They then register an interest in whether they want to write an ACP. We offer them an online tool to use. After a fixed period, probably about 3 months, we will collect the results of those who've made a plan and look at them and see whether they're adequate. And those who haven't produced a plan we'll go back to, and then we'll offer one-to-one support for the people who have a plan that isn't adequate or people who haven't managed a plan. And then at the end of the period, which will probably be a couple of years, I would imagine, we'll assess the final plans and then see what we have achieved. So in summary, what I'm talking about here is taking charge of your future. I mean, we make our own decisions about everything else in our life, even things which we're not sure how they're going to go, and yet we tend not to do that about our death. And I think it's about taking charge of your death as best you can. Tool for change, yes, I think ACP would be a tool for change in general, and you're more likely to achieve what I call a comfortable death. It's difficult. I'm not comfortable with healthy death. I can't find the right word. I've been looking for the right word. What is a good death? I don't like good either. Comfortable, you're comforted. It's comforting for other people. Maybe that's a good word. Maybe we could discuss that. What's the right word to be using? And as a means to reduce complicated grief. And in a way, it's a final act of love. It's an act of love to your loved ones, that you are giving them the chance of experiencing you having a comfortable death and all that that means to them. And that's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Lyn. Thank you very much.